Welcome to Radio Who, What, Why. I'm Jeff Schechtman. Over 500,000 people have already died in the Syrian civil war, now in its seventh year. The refugee crisis involving almost 12 million is one of the great humanitarian crises of our time. The original civil war has become a proxy war that has now drawn in Turkey, Russia, Iran, Israel, ISIS, and the United States. And there's no reason to assume that the war will not continue for many years to come. And like the Lebanon civil war, which raged for 15 years, there'll be no good or conclusive outcome. Here to talk about all of this and to bring us up to date, I'm joined by Charles Glass. Charles is a broadcaster, journalist, and writer. He began his journalism career in 1973 as a reporter for ABC in Beirut. He covered the October Arab-Israeli War on the Egyptian and Syrian fronts. He's covered the civil war in Lebanon. He was ABC's chief Middle East correspondent from 1983 to 1993, and he's most recently been a freelance writer covering the Middle East, the Balkans, Southeast Asia, and the Mediterranean region. He's written and published several books. His most recent is Syria Burning, and it is my pleasure to welcome Charles Glass back to Radio Who, What, Why. Charles, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
One of the things that certainly seems to be the case today is that, and Syria is certainly a part of it, but the whole region seems to be more dangerous, more volatile today than it has been in a long time. Talk about your perception of that, first of all.
The Middle East has always been a region of conflict. I mean, since the Ottoman Empire collapsed in 1918, there have been many wars in the region, some of which nearly led to nuclear conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union, including in 1967 and 1973, where we almost had the world destroyed. So it is a place of chronic conflict that always seems to involve the great powers when it gets out of hand.
And as you look at it today, how do you see the situation in terms of historical context?
Well, I think that the big problems at the moment are the international conflict between the U.S. and Russia over who will control the Middle East and its resources, and also between, on the one side, Saudi Arabia and Israel, on the other, Iran, over who will dominate the region. That is most clearly manifested in Syria, where there's a proxy war going on with the Russians and the Iranians arming the Syrian army, and the United States, Turkey, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Britain, and France helping the rebels against the regime, and that war goes on, and it doesn't seem that anyone is getting a grip and making an agreement to bring it to an end.
And there doesn't seem to be anything on the horizon to bring it to an end, that it has the potential to drag on for as long as the Lebanon civil war did.
The Lebanon war ended when the international powers that had been involved in Lebanon decided that it had outlived its usefulness. And so they forced an agreement called the Taif Agreement for the town in Saudi Arabia where the Lebanese warlords were brought. And they had to sign this accord, which Lebanon has had to live with ever since. The warlords didn't like it, but Lebanon internally has been at peace ever since. It's had some Israeli invasions, but the militias in Lebanon, for the most part, have ceased to exist, except for Hezbollah. And Lebanon is actually quite a pleasant place to live at the moment. Syria could reach that stage, I suspect, if the United States and Russia decided enough was enough and they were not going to supply arms to either side, and they were going to bring those two sides to the table and force some kind of agreement. Because the Syrian government has more or less won the war in all the populous areas of the country, it would involve the U.S. accepting that Bashar al-Assad will stay as president for the foreseeable future, and Russia might then have to make other concessions.
And where does the war that seems to be going on inside the war with respect to the Turks and the Kurds, where does that stand? How does that play into this?
Well, Turkey invaded the pocket of Afrin in northwest Syria in January and expelled the Kurdish militia there, the PYG, and has been threatening to take the main Kurdish area in the northeast where the U.S. has troops from the Kurds, which is also along the Turkish border, because the Turks don't want the Kurds to have any kind of autonomy in Syria or anywhere else. because it would set a bad example for them, because they have a very, very large Kurdish population that would like a federal system or autonomy, and some would even prefer independence from Turkey. The Turks, I think the only reason they haven't gone into the northeast is the fact that the U.S. has troops there, and I don't think they want a conflict between two NATO powers. But meanwhile, Afrin, which had been a peaceful area throughout the war, under an understanding between the Kurdish forces and the Syrian government that there wouldn't be any fighting there, has now been completely devastated by the Turkish army and the jihadist militias that it used as vanguards in many of its attacks in the Kurdish areas.
Talk about the way in which the population has been hollowed out, given how many refugees have left the country, and what that bodes for the future of the country.
Well, so the Syrian economy is completely shattered. Oil production is at a low. I mean, Syria didn't produce much oil for export, but it did produce almost enough for its own domestic consumption. Its agriculture has been devastated. The medical system has been ruined. Education has suffered. The rebuilding will, if the war ever ends, the rebuilding will be long and costly. In the meantime, those probably more than 5 million Syrians who have left the country, some have shown signs of coming back, and some are waiting to see how it all plays out. And I suspect many won't come back until they're sure that it's safe to raise their families again.
Even within the 7 years of the war, it does seem like every time it begins to feel like there might be an end in sight, or that the energy has gone out of it, it kind of gets another wind, a second wind or a third wind. Talk about that.
That seems to be because the outside powers, who still have a vested interest in trying to reverse the trend of the war, have reasserted themselves. It looked, for a time, Trump announced that he was going to pull out, and that Syria was going to pull out the 2,000 troops from the northeast, and that Syria was none of America's business. It looks as if he's changed his mind about that, which gives the green light to America's allies, Britain, France, Turkey, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia, to go on arming the jihadi and other militias to continue the fight. Most of them now are concentrated in several zones, most of them in the province of Idlib, where there are tens of thousands of militants still with great firepower. And if the government wants to take that back, it will be a very bloody battle.
Talk about the physical devastation to the country.
That varies from region to region. I was recently down in Soweto, which is in the Druze Mountain in the south, near the Israeli-occupied Golan Heights. That area has been relatively peaceful, and the capital of the province, which is called Soweto, is untouched by the war. Afrin was untouched by the war until the Turkish invasion in January. The coastal area where many Alawis live, the two ports of Latakia and Tartus, had suffered some shelling but not much damage. But then if you go further inland to the major cities of Aleppo, Homs, and Hama, you see massive devastation, particularly in Aleppo and Homs. I mean, more than half of Homs is now completely leveled. And while many people in Homs have taken refuge in the coast and would like to come back, there's really nothing for them to come back to until someone can help them to clear all that concrete and rebuild their houses. Something similar has happened in eastern Aleppo, which had been held by the rebels for years, and the government took back in December of 2016. Some rebuilding is going on, and some people have moved even into the rubble and erected tents so that they don't lose their property rights, and when the houses are rebuilt, that they'll be able to stay where they were before. And there is a little bit of business going on in Aleppo, which was the commercial capital of Syria, and some more people are probably going back to Aleppo than to Homs. Hama, quite badly damaged. Damascus, the main part of Damascus, the capital and the most populous city in the country, the major part of the city is slightly damaged, not much harm done. But the suburbs where the rebels have been leveled. Muadamiyah, Daraya, Douma, these places where the rebels took over and then faced the onslaught of the government, including the Russian Air Force. Those areas will have to be completely rebuilt. And I suspect that given what happened, the government may not want all of those people to come back and may want to resettle them elsewhere.
Mm-hmm. Talk a little bit about the chemical weapons issue, the recent missile attacks by the United States, Britain, and France, and whether or not, one, the attacks made any difference at all, and what we really know about the degree of these chemical weapons attacks.
Well, the chemical weapons issue has been raised several times during the war, but usually for political propaganda purposes. The United States, as you know, drew a red line around chemical weapons under President Obama, and then when chemical weapons were used in the suburbs of Damascus and eastern Ghouta, they say that Obama backed down and didn't bomb when he should have. But in fact, Obama was calling for the Syrians to permit UN weapons inspectors from the OPCW, the Organization for the Prevention of Chemical Weapons, to go and inspect. And he agreed to that, and he agreed to the destruction of his chemical weapons stockpiles. So in a way, you could say that Obama achieved his objective without bombing. In the case of the most recent alleged or real use, I don't really know, of chemical weapons in Duma, I don't know why the United States, Britain, and France did not wait for the chemical weapons inspectors to conduct their investigation and then decide what they were going to do about it. Instead, they bombed in advance. It's a bit like having the execution before the trial. They acted. They bombed. They gave the Russians a week to evacuate areas that might be bombed so that Russians wouldn't be killed by U.S. air power, which could really raise the stakes. Has it changed much? Probably not. Both sides in the war have used chemical weapons to some degree. Each side blames the other in every instance. And you have to remember that there's a huge psychological warfare campaign costing millions of dollars on both sides for each side to blame the other for everything bad that happens in the country. And so it's very hard to believe almost anything you hear.
Mm-hmm. The 2,000 U.S. troops that are there, what are they accomplishing?
Originally, they were there to help the Kurds and some of the Arab tribes in the northeast eliminate the ISIS, Islamic State presence in that part of Syria, which they did. They took Raqqa, which was the ISIS capital in Syria, just as on the other side of the border with the Kurds, but also with the Baghdad government, they eliminated ISIS's territorial base there. So in theory, it's what they intended to do, they have done. Now they're staying, and the policy is not clear because originally, then Secretary of State Rex Tillerson said that the 2,000 troops would stay to help the Kurds and those few Arab tribes that are working with the Kurds, but more importantly, to keep Iran from enjoying its victory in Syria and to contain what they call contain Iran. Although Iran isn't in those areas, they don't want any Iranians or Hezbollah to go into those areas. So it's part of a long game against Iran, not so much about Syria itself.
And talk about where Iran is in this conflict and where Israel is in it, in terms of that proxy war that's going on there as well.
Iran has been a strategic ally of Syria since the Islamic Revolution of 1979, when Hafez al-Assad, who was then president of Syria, decided to go with the Iranians because he, unlike the United States at the time, had a visceral hatred of Saddam Hussein and what Saddam Hussein was doing in Iraq, and Saddam's occasional interference in Syria's internal affairs. So he sided with the Iranians. He gave them diplomatic and political support during the war with Iraq, which lasted from 1982 to 1989. And in that period, Hafez al-Assad became very unpopular with the rest of the Arab world who were supporting Saddam Hussein, and also unpopular with the United States, which was supporting Saddam Hussein. Later, he mended his fences with the U.S., but his son has kept that strategic alliance, which the United States would like to break the back of. And for 7 years, they've been trying to break the back of it, and all they've been able to do actually is strengthen it, because in 2011, before the war began, while Bashar al-Assad had this understanding with Iran, he wasn't dependent on Iran. Now, because his own army has been very badly mauled in the war, he is relying on Hezbollah and Iran to stay in position, and he's more tightly bound to them than ever before.
What could transpire, what might transpire that would lower the temperature, that might at least be a few first steps toward bringing this to some kind of conclusion?
It's no longer an internal Syrian issue. I mean, if all the Syrian parties on both sides got together, they probably wouldn't agree on much of anything, but they could get some talks going. But the people who pay them, the people who supply them with weapons, have to decide that they're going to tell the locals that the war is over, and if they don't accept an agreement that is dictated by the United States and Russia, that they won't be getting any more money and any more weapons. And that's pretty much what did it in Lebanon. It would probably do the same in Syria.
And what about jihadist groups there? You mentioned that and we've certainly heard repeatedly that ISIS has been more or less wiped out there. What other jihadist groups are still operating within Syria?
Well, ISIS is still operating in Syria. It has a small pocket in part of Damascus near the Palestinian refugee camp of Yarmouk. It has some positions near Deraa, which is on the border with Jordan, where the revolution began in 2011. And it has people in Idlib as well. It often fights against the other jihadists. There are various groups, and probably several hundred jihadist groups, all with different names, Jaish al-Islam, Army of Islam, and so forth. And Jabhat al-Nusra was the biggest, but it's changed its name several times to try and make itself more acceptable, to get more weapons from the West. And it occasionally fights against ISIS, but its ideology is identical. There are personality problems between the two groups. I think that in the long term, the Turks and the United States and the Russians will have to agree on some method of disarming them and getting them out of Syria. And failing that, then the Syrian army, with Russian air power and possibly the help of Iran and Hezbollah from Lebanon, will go into Idlib province and we'll see destruction like we saw in eastern Aleppo, the suburbs of Damascus, and in Homs.
Talk about the way in which this war is being covered and how much coverage there is, what the coverage looks like in Europe versus what you understand it to be here in the U.S., and talk a little bit about the inside baseball aspect to this, if you will.
Well, the coverage has been episodic. At the beginning, the narrative was that Syria was part of the Arab Spring and that the demonstrations and a few rifle shots would overthrow the dictator of Syria the way the dictator of Egypt and the dictator of Libya and the dictator of Tunisia were all overthrown. But that didn't work out. And as the momentum of the war gathered pace, the people who did the best fighting against the government, who were the best armed because they were getting their weapons and their money from fundamentalist Sunni Muslim states, i.e. Saudi Arabia and Qatar, became to dominate the entire revolution. And those people who thought of themselves as secular and democratic were pushed aside by them, and it became largely a war of jihadis versus the army of the dictatorship.
And talk about your own experience covering the war there.
I go as often as I can. It's not always easy to obtain a visa, but when I get a visa, it's very easy. I take a taxi from Beirut to Damascus, check into a hotel, and go and start talking to people. And if I'm able to go to Aleppo, as I have many times, or to Homs, or to Hama, or to Soweto, or different parts of the country, then I'll go without getting myself killed. I have not crossed the lines into the rebel areas, one, because it's impossible from the government side to go through the checkpoints and get to the rebel areas. And two, if I went in from Turkey with the rebels, I would, like many of my colleagues, risk being kidnapped by jihadis and beheaded.
To what extent do other events in the Middle East right now impact what's happening in Syria?
Well, Syria is part of a larger struggle that includes Yemen, where the Saudis and, to some degree, the Iranians are fighting a war that is devastating that once beautiful and peaceful country. And there's also the conflict in Iraq against ISIS, and the sort of continuing simmering animosity between Sunnis and Shiites plays into that. In that struggle, the Saudis would like to represent all the Sunnis of the Arab world and keep the Shia down, and Iran would like to represent all the Shia of the Arab world and keep the Sunnis out of power, at least in Syria and in Yemen. But it's a very vicious game on all sides, and the Arab world is suffering for it. And at the same time that this is going on, of course, Israel is devastating the lives of people in Gaza. Gaza is, has often been said, the world's largest open-air prison, which is regularly bombed. Children, all suffering mental traumas from years of bombardment and confinement, because neither Egypt nor Israel will let these people go out to travel or import basic necessities or export anything. Their lives are absolute hell. So the Arab world, which should be paying some attention to the suffering of these Palestinians in Gaza, is so busy tearing itself apart that it's ignoring them completely.
And who is paying attention? Is there any attention being paid at the United Nations, in Europe, anywhere?
Well, you could say that NGOs are paying attention to the United Nations, UNICEF, World Health Organization, the World Food Program. They're all in Syria. They're all in Yemen. They're all trying to ameliorate the suffering of the civilian populations that that are dying and their health is suffering and so forth. However, the problem really isn't humanitarian. The consequence is humanitarian. The problem is political.
Charles Glass, I thank you so much for spending time with us.
Thank you very much, Jeff. Good to talk to you.
Thank you. And thank you for listening and for joining us here on Radio Who, What, Why. I hope you join us next week for another Radio Who, What, Why podcast. I'm Jeff Schechtman. If you like this podcast, please feel free to share and help others find it by rating and reviewing it on iTunes. You can also support this podcast and all the work we do by going to whowhatwhy.org/donate.